Okie dokie. We'll call the Assembly Committee of the Whole meeting to order on December 19th. Thanks for hanging out for all technical difficulties. Madam Mayor, can you do the land acknowledgement?
Certainly. We would like to acknowledge that the city and borough of Genoa is on Tlingit land and wish to honor the indigenous people of this land. For more than 10,000 years, Alaska Native people have been and continue to be an integral to the well-being of our community. We are grateful to be in this place, a part of this community, and to honor the culture, traditions, and resilience of the Tlingit people. Kunochish.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. The clerk will note the roll. Everyone's here except Wahal Gidak is not with us tonight. Any changes to the agenda? I see nobody nodding their head. Approval of minutes. We have two sets of minutes, May 12th and December 11th Assembly Retreat. I understand that Ms. Hale has some minor edits to the December 11th meeting minutes. Is that correct?
That is correct. And it's May 2nd, and I have one minor edit to that, and I will share both of those with the clerk.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any objection to the adoption of those with Ms. Hale's edits? Okay, we'll go on to the agenda topics. We have 5 of them. And the first one, gondola revenue sharing agreement. This is something that was introduced already to the assembly at the last assembly meeting, referred here, and it's scheduled for hearing in the January meeting. It's an opportunity for folks to ask any questions if they have any. The Eagle Crest board has approved of the general framework of this agreement, and they have not seen the actual words, and they'll do that before the assembly meets in January. But the guts of it is the revenue sharing part on page 6 regarding what happens 10% and it's et cetera. That is the table that you all saw, or the table was a representation of this, not the other way around. So anybody want to say anything? No. Who has questions? Anyone? Oh, Mr. Watt, go ahead.
He was. Thank you, Deputy Mayor. No, just to recap that we talked about this conceptually at the last committee of the whole. So there's a summary memo which explains the terms. This agreement, obviously, the 15-page agreement, much more detailed, would take an ordinance to pass. We also have Chair Satry here tonight if you're interested in asking questions of the Eagle Crest board. But this is the opportunity to ask questions of staff or the Eagle Crest manager or the Eagle Crest board before we go to public hearing, or we may hear from the public as well.
Thank you, Mr. Watt. I talked to Mr. Satry today, and the board, like as I said, the board hasn't seen this exact words. They conceptually agreed with the general terms about percentages and the revenue sharing. That's what they were paid attention on. Did you want to say anything, Mr. Satry?
Yes, he does.
Yeah, go.
First, Mike wants to say something.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Press the button.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity. For the record, Mike Satry, current chair of the Eagle Crest board. As you summarized earlier, when your packet came out a few days ago, is the first time the board has had a chance to see the actual verbiage of the entire contract. But we did see at our prior board meeting at the beginning of this month, the terms in that same table showing the back and forth in terms of attendance and what the revenues and the revenue sharing would be. So at that, and of course over the course of the negotiations, Mr. Scanlon has provided the board with updates on where we were at. So what our plan is, and we really appreciate the assembly taking this up in a quick fashion over the holidays, but we have our normal monthly board meeting on I believe it's the 5th, that first Thursday of January. And our intent is to approve the contract at that time, or have a motion to approve the contract. The board had been ready to do a meeting at short notice, a special meeting just for the contract, but because it looks like our meeting will fall in line with the assembly schedule, we'll just stick to our normal schedule that we have in front of us.
Great, thanks, Mr. Satry. Anyone have questions for Mr. Watt or Mr. Satry or anybody? Ms. Tree.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I have a couple of clarifying questions an amendment to make at some point and a comment. So I'll start with questions and then get back in line. On page 26, packet page 26, which is page 7 of the agreement. This section D, which is about summer operations receipts and kind of defining that. I just want to clarify something. Paragraph II talks about, this revenue is coming from things that are owned and operated by the city. And then paragraph IV says explicitly excluding existing amenities, et cetera, owned by a third party operator. So this is before the date of this agreement. If a tour operator begins operating after this agreement is in place, just want to clarify that their revenue is not subject to this agreement. Is that correct?
Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Ms. Stream. So you are correct, but I need to kind of put some sideboards on that there may be packages that are created that specifically include the gondola sale of a ticket, and that would be likely subject to a capture depending on how that package is established.
Ms. Stream?
Go ahead. Let's see. Just two more tiny little clarifying questions. Packet page 27, paragraph VI about confidential documents. What kinds of documents could be confidential under the Public Records Act? This is Gold Belt's documents that they might mark as confidential.
Mr. Palmer.
You may have stumped me on that one. I'll just say that Gold Belt probably has some financial records that are wholly related to their other businesses that are not related to this. And there's no need for the CBJ to see those. That's not related to this project. Anything that goes back and forth between the CBJ and Gold Belt would presumptively be open. But there may be some, limited reason to keep those confidential. I can't think of one right now, but I'm not saying it doesn't exist.
One more.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And then last question, which is packet page 28, paragraph IV, talking about setting prices for the passes, et cetera. Is that going to be done by the board? I assume the board currently has control over pricing. Is that going to continue?
Can you give me the ordinance or the revenue?
Yeah, so it's page 9 of the agreement at the top of the page.
IV, she said.
So, thank you. That obligation is the city, so we get to set those prices, and obviously there's going to be some back and forth consultation with Gold Belt to see that happen.
Okay.
Ms. Candies.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just a follow-up question on the Ms. Stream's question about confidentiality. I know that was a stumper in terms of what documents might fall under that, but is that something that CBJ will also be? Sounds insane to say, will you be reviewing the confidential documents and then agreeing they're confidential? But
Mr. Palmer.
are there any sort of sideboards on that, what they can and cannot mark confidential?
Mr. Palmer.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a classic issue that we encounter with a fair amount of regularity, maybe not quite once a month, but close to it. If a business or an individual provides us some document, and sometimes they're marked confidential, sometimes they're not. If we get a Public Records Act request, we review things to determine if it can be withheld or if it should be withheld. So just because something's marked confidential doesn't mean it is going to be withheld. Under the contract, it has a 5-day provision that if we identify something that Gold Belt has marked as confidential and we believe it's not, we give Gold Belt 5 days to go to court to seek a protective order so we don't disclose it.
Okay, thanks. I just want to make sure I was understanding that correct.
More questions? Ms. Stream, you had another more, or you were?
Yeah, I've got an amendment to offer, if I can. So on packet page 30, which is page 11 of the agreement, looking at section 13. So I discussed, this is equal employment opportunity. I discussed this with the attorney earlier. My understanding is that this paragraph is kind of boilerplate language when we get money from, when we receive money from, say, like the federal government. This is something we have to promise. But Gold Belt being an ANC, I don't know if they do have shareholder hiring preference, but they can if they want to. So my amendment would be just to strike this section number 13. They are not operating, so they're not working, and this, having this paragraph in here, having it not in here doesn't change anything. So I would change the outcome of how anything would work. So I would just move to strike it so that there's no confusion about whether we're asking Gold Belt to set aside their normal hiring practices. So I would make that motion that we strike paragraph 13 on page 11 of the agreement and ask for unanimous consent.
Ms. Hale.
I'd like to object, and it may just be purpose of a question and probably a question for Mr. Palmer. And I also want to thank my colleague, Ms. Stream, for her very close reading of this contract. I appreciate it very much. This paragraph is here for a reason. I mean, it's not just boilerplate, but CBJ, for example, has just received recognition for the really excellent job that we've done at offering protection for many different people. So my question to you, Mr. Palmer, for example, if there were transgender employee and Gold Belt was involved in hiring and did not want to hire that person, would striking this paragraph do anything about that, for example?
Mr. Palmer.
Yeah, thank you. I think we need to maybe set kind of the frame here. So this agreement maybe is more like a loan where Gold Belt would, if this is ultimately adopted by both parties, Gold Belt and the Assembly, Gold Belt would be loaning $10 million to the CBJ. The CBJ would then be the one who's doing all the actions. And so I'm not quite sure if that question arises because Gold Belt's only loaning money to the city, and this is in this model, and the city's paying it back under these terms. So the city would be the one who would be hiring people or not, and an individual who I believe it was transgender, that individual under city law would be a protected class, and that is protected under a wide variety of things, including our CBJ charter, state law, and new interpretations of federal law.
If I could follow up.
Go ahead.
I guess, and I know, Ms. Stream, you said this was kind of boilerplate, but I not having read this as closely as you have, I am just worried to agree to strike it, not really understanding why it was put. Perhaps you can speak to us about why it was put in there in the first place and what the purpose was supposed to have been.
Mr. Palmer.
Yeah, thank you. So this is a new realm for us. So it was put in because, as Ms. Stream described, it's standard contract language for us and our CBJ contracts. And we have not historically done business with Alaska Native corporations or tribes. And so I'll just offer that this may be actually an oversight. And there's, given the hiring preferences that tribal corporations have and tribes have as well, I think there's a fair argument that if this can eliminate some confusion so as not to trample on the tribes or Native corporations practices, that might be a valuable strike.
Mr. Palmer, I'll follow up. I still don't, why was it put in there to begin with? You're opining on whether it's a good idea to take it out or not. What, if Gold Belt doesn't have any operational things in this contract, they're not hiring anybody. And this only applies to this contract. It doesn't apply to the rest of their operations. What was the purpose of putting it in here? Or is there a purpose to putting it in here since they're not hiring anybody?
Yeah, thank you. So it was put in there because that's standard contract language that
Okay.
we've had.
Okay. Mr. Watt.
Deputy Mayor, maybe I can help. We sign contracts with lots of people and we would have this clause in there when we hire architects and engineers and snow plowing services and construction contracting and janitorial services and the full gamut of things that we hire people to do for the municipality with municipal funds. In this case, this is really more like a loan agreement and it's this more round peg, square hole type thing.
Mr. Smith,
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I don't know if Gold Belt, I mean, they objected to this clause? I appreciate Ms. Treem trying to clean it up. I'm partial to maybe if it doesn't cause any issue, like why isn't this statement something that, I mean, I don't know. It seems like a good thing to have in contract language anyway. So have they objected? And then I guess the other thing was, I mean, is a hiring preference considered discrimination? I don't know. We might be getting deep into the weeds here now.
Mr. Watt,
Deputy Mayor, both of us. So no, I don't believe Gold Belt has objected. So we've hit this back and forth several times. And we've been focused on the economic terms. We've had outside counsel working on it for us in the law department, and they have outside counsel. So there's been, a lot of legal focus. But my knowledge, nobody's objected to it.
Ms. Dream.
I think Mr. Palmer was going to answer his second question.
Yeah, so the second question, this is a tricky issue. The Alaska Supreme Court has had the chance to rule on a question of municipal hiring preferences specifically to Alaska Natives, and the Alaska Supreme Court concluded that hiring preference violated the Alaska Constitution, and thus it's illegal for governments, municipal governments, to do in Alaska. So we, as a municipality, would be prohibited from having a hiring preference for Alaska Natives.
Okay, I'm going to call the question. Ms. Dream.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I just wanted to respond to one thing about, if it's not objectionable, why not just leave it in? But as Ms. Wall has mentioned recently, and as Mr. Palmer mentioned earlier, this is kind of new territory for CBJ to enter into business agreements with our local Native corporations. And I think that's something we all would like to see more of. And because of that, I say we should just, be respecting the way they operate, and they are allowed to operate. And if it makes no difference, ultimately, I think taking it out is just a good sign of being a good business partner.
Anybody else want to comment? Ms. Hale.
Thank you, and I really appreciate that. And I absolutely respect and want the ability for Gold Belt to hire shareholders, for example. I think it's really important. And I don't want to step on that. And so normally I appreciate Ms. Treen bringing this, but I just worry because it's so broad, and to take it out completely, it worries me because there's so much more in here than just being able to hire shareholders. So that it concerns me.
I'll just briefly speak. They haven't objected. I don't want to. This is a statement of the municipal values and law that the city has established, and I think we should leave it in unless I heard from Gold Belt that it causes them some sort of problem, which they haven't said. So, Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. For the amendment to the agreement to remove paragraph 13 as found on page 30 of your packet. Ms. Treen.
Yes.
Mr. Bryson.
No.
Ms. Hughes Scandies.
Yes.
Ms. Wall,
Yes.
Mr. Smith,
No,
Ms. Hale,
No.
Madam Mayor,
Yes.
and Deputy Mayor Gladysevsky.
No,
Two, three.
so the motion
Motion
fails.
fails.
Any other comments, questions, motions? Ms. Dream?
Just one comment that I've made before and will continue to make as we move through this process. The whereas clauses in the ordinance and the whereas clauses in the agreement do make assumptions about what we're doing moving forward with summer operations at Eagle Crest. And I would like to reiterate my ask that we have a public process about what that looks like.
Madam Mayor. Ms. Huskadis.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Ms. Stream just hit on something that I also was noticing about the ordinance itself. I just want to double check where we are in the process. We've already introduced this ordinance, correct? So is it better to, I know the whereases seem like a nothing thing, but I personally would like to make an amendment to one of our whereases.
Go ahead.
For that same reason. So this is just going to be the very first one on page 1 of 2, our packet, page 18. And I would move to strike on line 10, the rest of the sentence starting with and other associated amenities, facilities and visitor attractions. And if I could speak to that.
Well, first I want to understand what it
Sure.
is.
Yep.
Line 10, you want to
So you'd put
semicolon after the word system?
Yep.
Okay. Go ahead.
Everyone good with that? I mean, understand that, not good with that, not good with that. Okay, and I'll speak to that briefly. Hopefully this doesn't freak Gold Belt out, which is not my intention. But the reason I'm bringing this forward is just because I do think that as an assembly, we've spoken to having more public process around the further development of the mountain. And if we're serious about that, I think it is a bit disingenuous for us to say, whereas we desire to develop a whole bunch of stuff on the top of the mountain and then say, and we'll have a public process about a whole bunch of stuff on top of the mountain now that we've committed to this. That being said, I can appreciate that that's probably part of the business case for Gold Belt. So that would be my amendment.
So any questions, comments about the amendment? Mr. Smith?
thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I understand Ms. Huskandy's point. I guess probably an alternative that I would prefer would be something about having a public process or something. I mean, I don't know how much of a difference it makes. It does seem like I've heard that to make the business case, to make the business sense work for a gondola, you have to have something besides a gondola to go up and do. Anyway, I'm not sure what it changes, but I'm also not sure what it really does either.
Yep, Ms. Hale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I agree with Ms. Treeman and Ms. Iskandis that the whole public process was kind of abruptly cut short, and I do like the idea of it somehow restarting. And so I agree with Ms. Iskandis edit.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I don't see how taking the line out prevents anything, so I'm going to hold my objection. However, I do want to remind us that Eagle Crest is a normally privately regular business operated. And if we hamstring Eagle Crest and make it what should run as a public or a private venture and hamstring it with public rules and the inability to respond, or had we slowed the process down, we wouldn't have had the gondola. So while we are a government body, we have that level of responsibility of the citizens, we also have a couple of enterprise boards that have to respond to business climate, and business rules are slightly different than government rules. And so I just want to keep that in mind while we're making sure we have a public process. We don't want to harm Eagle Crest for the process. I don't have any objections. Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor.
More comments about the motion? I'll just briefly say we are entering an agreement to do a gondola system and something. So if it doesn't matter so much to me, the whereas clauses are not binding, but it concerns me that we're talking about maybe we're not going to do anything. So I don't want to send that message either. The board has worked for a long time and has quite an extensive public process. It might not be enough for, everybody's tastes, but it's not nothing. And we have been talking about this for a long time. So I don't object because I don't know that it matters too much, but we are entering an agreement to do some significant developments up there. Ms. Wall. Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to identify on page 2 of the ordinance, page 2 of the agreement, whereas clause B has nearly the identical language that would be agreed to by the parties. So if this motion passes, then I will strike that language in whereas 2. I don't know if that's going to have a material impact on the agreement or not.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer. Then I would change my opinion on the motion then. Mr. Bryson.
I'm gonna officially object.
Yep. Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I just wanted to put in my 2 cents about kind of public process here. I know there's been public process about it, and yet I still feel like there are lots of people who are, Eagle Crest users who want to continue to be involved in this discussion. And so I would just continue to encourage us to make sure when we're thinking about big changes in the future that we are continually engaging the public in a significant way. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Wall. I agree with you. Ms. Euskandis.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I won't push this any further. We can just have the vote and move on. I just will point out what can seem like a nothing thing. It is not my intention to, like I said, I don't want to freak out Gold Belt. I know a lot of work has gone into this. As somebody who lost a 5-4 vote about the gondola, I have it's my intention to see it succeed because that's the way the vote went. So I don't want to relitigate the issue. However, I know that if I go back and rewatch those tapes as I go to sleep, I know that we put a lot of chatter into, we just need to get this right now. And then we can slow down and we can talk about it and we can, and there has been a lot of talk. That's what I said. I'm not trying to freak anyone out, but to continuously say like, whoa, we can't talk about not doing anything. We agreed to everything. No, we didn't. And I can play you some quotes of people saying, let's just buy it so we don't lose out on the thing. And then we'll talk about what happens. So I'm just going to keep being the voice in the room that said, well, we said we would talk about what happened. So and with that, we can just vote. And
Ms. Euskandis, I hope you're not listening to tapes of the.
I'm not, just when I can't sleep.
Miss Hutter Smith. It took me a while.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. As the former chair of the Eagle Crest Summer Operations Task Force, when I had spoken with city staff about a more robust public process, the decision was kind of made that once there was something to actually discuss, and that was an agreement with Gold Belt, that was when we would engage as a stronger public process. The task force was not extended. I still know, and I've heard from many people and still hope that there will be a strong public process to talk about a number of different things. Non-commercial areas of the mountain, that type of stuff. That needs to happen. I don't know if someone can tell us when that will happen or where. But I don't want to mess up a contract that's been gone back and forth and has seemingly, I don't know, it's not signed, so it's not agreed to, but don't really want to blow that up. Just because we don't necessarily have an idea of when the public process is, but.
Okay, you ready for the question? The motion is to delete, put a semicolon after the word gondola system on line 10 on page 18 of our packet, and delete and other associated amenities, facilities, and visitor attractions. Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. And this was Ms. Hughes Scandy's amendment number 2. Ms. Hughes Scandy's, how do you vote?
Yes.
And Ms. Hale,
No.
Mr. Bryson,
No.
Mr. Smith,
No,
Ms. Treen,
Yes.
Ms. Wall,
No.
Madam Mayor,
No.
and Madam Deputy Mayor.
No.
Motion fails.
All right, thank you. Any more, Mr. Madam Mayor?
I believe I heard Mr. Smith volunteer to be chair of the Eagle Crest Summer Task Force.
Did you have another motion?
Oh, I certainly do. I would move ordinance 2022, I'm catching on to your things, 2022-63 to the full assembly for public hearing.
Any objection? Okay, thank you, Mr. Satry. Look forward to hearing what the Eagle Crest Board has to say. And thanks, Mr. Scanlon, and all you folks for coming in, for all your work on this. Okay, number 4 or number 2 or whatever, Docks and Harbors Land Management Code update. Yeah, what? Okay, we're gonna take a 2 minute pause for the clerk to do something. Okay, we'll call the meeting back to order. And we're going to move on to the next item, which is, thank you very much, Docks and Harbors Land Management Code update. Is that Mr. Yucatel? Are you speaking to that, Mr. Manager? Yep, Mr. Manager's pointing at you. So this is some cleaning up of some code language that called for the Docks and Harbors Board to do their own land management plan, and that seems like not such a good idea. So, Mr. Yukatel.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Maybe for some background. This past summer, Docks and Harbors had several requests for land action. And so we really started diving into Title 85 and seeing what we were supposed to be doing, what the board was supposed to be executing on behalf of the assembly. And so we found out that we were kind of deficient in one area of having a Docks and Harbors land management plan. And to cure that, working with the law department, one of the options that was proposed was to essentially just include the Docks and Harbors land management plan under the CBJ wide land management plan, which seemed like a good compromise. So we went forward with that. The board went forward with that. And the board met several times and again, kind of struggled with some language about the mission of the board in retaining or selling tideland. So the board met several times and talked about that. And the language that the board fell on was essentially the same language that was in Title 85. I think what the board struggles with is being guided by these principles, and whether that's a recommendation or an absolute. So in the end, in your packet on page 40, the language that was drafted by the law department was accepted by the board, and then the board wanted to make a change that's highlighted in yellow there, that instead of tidelands, the board recommends property under the jurisdiction of Docks and Harbors should be leased for only specific water dependent and water related uses and not sold. That's where the board was at. This went before the Lands, Housing and Economic Development Committee, I think probably in September or October. At that point, that committee recommended it be brought to the committee of the whole at a future date. So that's why it's before this body tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Yukatel. Who has questions for Ms. Yukatel, Mr. Palmer, Mr. Watt? Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. On that subsection that Mr. Yukatel just talked about on page 40. So I've been I brought it up in Lands and I've been thinking about it since. I believe the structure of the edit is a little different, so it's striking tidelands, but the property under the jurisdiction of Docks and Harbors is now new text, even though it's shown as highlighted. So it should be underlined, right? My two things with that are just, are there non-tideland properties under the jurisdiction of Docks and Harbors that shouldn't be leased for specific water dependent and water related uses? And are there some that, and should the general guiding principle be that the general guiding principles to the Docks and Harbor Board that all Docks and Harbor properties should not be sold? Looking at the land management plan, I don't believe any of the Docks and Harbors property are designated for disposal. And I don't know about, are there Docks and Harbors properties that really just don't make sense to be water dependent and water related uses?
Okay.
I'm just wondering if we're, boxing in the board by expanding that clause from tidelands now to all properties under Docks and Harbors.
Mr. Yukatel? Did you guys have a conversation about that, or?
That language was a recommendation from a board member that was supported by the entire board. I don't know if it's appropriate for me to comment on, kind of policy decisions that the board has made specifically under that. I will say that the vast majority of Docks and Harbors managed property does adjoin tidelands. There are cats and dogs of odd parcels that Docks and Harbors has under land management plan that are away from the water. I don't know if I can answer it any better than that.
Madam Mayor has a,
Would it make sense for those cats and dogs land uses to be come back to our lands department instead of Docks and Harbors Board, or does it make sense for you guys to still maintain jurisdiction?
Mr. Yukatel?
I'm sure there's properties in the lands management plan that there's odds, like near in T Harbor, there's some uplands that is kind of an oddity that we in the land management plan says Docks and Harbors manages it. So there are a handful of that. I know we only update the land management plan every 10 years. It's a big lift. So certainly unless Mr. Bladorn wants to take a whack at updating it sooner, it's certainly, I think it's probably wise at the next update to look at all those properties in totality and see where they should rest.
So, Mr. Yukatel, do you think there may be some lands that are under Docks and Harbors jurisdiction, like the ones you just mentioned, that maybe shouldn't be? Maybe. I mean, I know you.
Madam Chair, I would say, yeah, I'd question why it's in our portfolio.
Okay. And maybe we should just get them out of their portfolio rather than changing this language. That could be one. Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I find it interesting that the board decided to change this clause when I think some of the discussion around this was really about the should be leased and this idea of guiding principles. If it says, it said tidelands should be leased only for specific water dependent and water related uses and not sold. They weren't sure whether that meant we should never sell it. And so this question's for Mr. Palmer. The way that this is written, that there's multiple principles, one of which says tidelands or property should not be sold. Does that mean we could sell it, or the board could decide to sell it if point 1, 2, and 3 made a stronger argument for selling it than the 4th that says do not sell?
Mr. Palmer.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a combination of issues here. One is the guiding principles type of concept. The other is this language in here with a should. So it's not mandatory, but it
Shall.
it's suggestive. But the other piece is that our land management plan as it actually designates nearly all, I don't know about every parcel, but nearly all Docks and Harbors parcels as retain. And so it doesn't say retain / dispose, or it doesn't say dispose. And so there's definitely a strong indication that Docks and Harbors land, prior to this draft, is probably not subject to sale. And so this draft would be opening up those options, not necessarily prohibiting it or suggesting one way or the other, but this draft would outline the guidelines. And then if at the same time, the land management plan was updated to say retain dispose for Docks and Harbors properties, that would make it consistent. Or if you want to keep the land management plan solid as retained, then you can do that as well.
Okay. More questions? Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Just on that last part, Mr. Palmer. So I'm not familiar with how the land management plan is updated or what goes into it, but so again, when I search the land management plan, and maybe not perfect on it, but I didn't see anything that said retain, dispose, or dispose. So when that's updated and say there were properties that said dispose, I mean, would the way would this ordinance prevent things from being in the land management plan? Would this clause prevent when a land management plan is updated for docks and harbors properties to be changed to a disposed type designation.
Thank you. So if the assembly's direction is to have more discretion in the future, then I would recommend maybe changing this ordinance and striking out the last few letters on, or the few words on line 16, 17, and let me get you that specific language. And not sold. And then at the same time, if the assembly wants that discretion, then also changing the land management plan designation for the docks and harbors parcels from retain to retain/dispose. That would give you the maximum discretion if that's a goal you want, or if you don't, then this language is fine, and you can adjust the land management plan when you see the desire. If you have a specific request that comes in, and all land sales, just to be super clear, happen by ordinance. And so through one case specific ordinance, we can weave our way through the different pieces of code.
I would just, for me, I would just leave it in that it doesn't say shall, it says should. It gives some general guidance, but if you're concerned that something will never be able to be sold, I don't think that that's what this says personally. So if that's your concern, just FYI, I don't know if it makes any difference to you, but.
I guess my concern, I mean, I think we have two recent examples of where the board has decided to sell tideland. I think it was a somewhat, I'm not gonna say maybe not tormented isn't the right word, but anyway, it was a bit of a, there was multiple iterations at it. And I just am, if by putting this language in, I mean, I don't think it'll prevent it from being sold, but it might just extend a process that maybe should be maybe shouldn't be as long.
You have something?
Because of the guiding principle. I don't have a perfect solution though. I'm still
Okay.
working on it.
Madam Mayor.
Well, the beauty of ordinances, they can be amended later on. So I would move ordinance 2022-48 to the full assembly.
Any objection? I have to open my microphone. Any objections? All right, thank you.
Madam
Yep.
Chair, can I just
Mr. Palmer?
clarify, does the body want to accept the highlighted change recommended by Docks and Harbors Board?
I thought that was. part
That's
of
the motion.
Perfect,
so
thank
sorry.
you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Yucatel. Appreciate it. Thank you for going through all. My microphone on. Thank you to Ms. Wall for making the housing language, which we had not seen before. What comments or questions does anyone have about the goals? Why do I have? Madam Mayor?
Seeing nobody leaping at that, I would move the assembly goals 2023 to the assembly for adoption.
Ms. Hughes Candies?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm just a little slow.
That's all right.
And,
Go ahead.
and now I'm leaping. I'm not really leaping. I'm just curious with housing the D and A, whether we think those are iterative of each other or if we see a big difference there. Because I would, and maybe someone could say, no, this is really saying this.
Ms. Wall?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. There may be different wording to make this clear. In my mind, I made these separate because A was about improving the code and D was about our process of improving the code and about how we manage land. And so this was more like, in what order do things happen? Can we, change the authorities that certain groups have? But there may be better words there to make that clear. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does. I was just not, that's exactly what I was looking for. Trying to make sure I understood.
Madam Mayor?
I said they could always work together and bring something to the assembly when it shows.
Yep, just wanted that little thing and I'm good.
That little kernel of
And I just-
knowledge.
All right,
Except-
hearing no objections. Oh, Mr. Smith.
Thanks. On goal 2, economic development, priority or implementing action G. Explore options for redeveloping underutilized downtown property. I'm glad that got in there. Part of me would want to just say commercial property. Maybe that's splitting hairs or something, and that it, you know, I guess I want the focus to be on commercial property, which could include, you know, apartments and that type of stuff, but anyway, when I kind of brought it up, the top priority for me is not, you know, some houses that are maybe not in the greatest shape, but more commercial property. So, actually, maybe I'll just make an amendment and see how it goes.
Go ahead.
I'd like to amend, implementing action G on goal 2 to explore options for redeveloping underutilized commercial downtown property.
Can I suggest to say underused, just because my pet peeved? So if we're gonna amend.
I'd accept that as a friend.
Thank you. Someone over there, Ms. Trim, you had your hand up?
Thanks, Madam Mayor. I get where Mr. Smith is coming from, and I agree with his goal to focus on commercial properties, but I can think of at least one underused residential building that exists downtown that I would love to see redeveloped. So I would just leave it as it is.
Mr. Bryson?
I too was objecting.
Yep.
Sorry, I too was objecting. Commercial buildings are not our problem. Lack of housing is our problem. And I just don't know that putting energy on commercial developers at this time is going to get us anywhere near our goals. I would prefer to leave it as is.
Okay, so we'll vote on the amendment to change it to Mr. Smith, you still want to do it? Yeah. Explore option, Madam Mayor.
I have a question to the amendment maker. So do you mean commercial downtown properties or do you mean commercial residential downtown properties? I guess that's my question.
Commercial properties that have residential on top is what you mean, right? Or what do you mean?
I mean commercial properties, some of which would be residential and some of which, you know, were former bars and restaurants or Elks Lodges or maybe I don't need to name them, sorry. It wouldn't just be residential properties. I think and I kind of mentioned at the retreat, there's some properties downtown that are vacant and in poor shape. And I think, you know, a negative to the economic development of downtown, economic activity in downtown.
Okay, so the amendment would be explore options for redeveloping underused commercial downtown properties.
Yes.
Okay, everybody clear? All right, Madam Clerk.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Mr. Smith,
Yes.
Ms. Hughes Candies,
No,
Ms. Hale,
No,
Mr. Bryson.
No.
Ms. Treem,
No,
Ms. Wall,
Yes.
Madam Mayor,
Yes,
and Madam Deputy Mayor.
No.
Motion fails, 3 yeas, 5 nays.
Okay, any more? Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I'm going to make a motion to strike this implementing action then. Without that amendment, I'm not sure what it's supposed to mean.
Okay, do you understand the motion?
object.
Okay,
Are you saying may I ask the maker of the motion to strike G? I would object, and can I explain my objection?
go ahead.
I think it's to me, it's quite clear. We have underused downtown properties. that include buildings like the building that Mr. Smith mentioned, and also include buildings that have apartments. And it's very clear that those, particularly some of them, very clear that they are not being used. And so to me, I feel like this is clear to me. So I think we should leave it in.
Ms. Hughes Candies, as you had your hand up, or did you want
Oh,
to
just objection.
just object? Okay.
Yeah, I think it makes good sense as is.
Ms. Wall.
Thank you. Maybe I was misinterpreting those who voted no. To me, commercial properties included apartment buildings. And so I thought the intent, maybe we had different intents, but it sounds like we all have the same intent. So I don't care what it says. If we're all focused on all those buildings that look bad, this is good.
Double thumbs up. Okay, so are you removing your motion? Thank you. Okay, great. Okay, any other motions?
Just a comment in that I hope we understand that like the priority for developing it's still underutilized downtown properties is not like a
move.
single family home or a duplex. I mean, even though, because those are residential properties, but an apartment is a commercial property. So, okay. Very good.
Okay. I move that we take utilize off of here all the way. Okay, anything else? Any other motions? You all good? So the Madam Mayor made a motion, did you not, to adopt these?
I made a motion to send them to the full assembly.
Okay,
Public to actually weigh in.
okay, right on. Okay, perfect. Hearing no objections, that's what we'll do. Cruise ship dock waterfront planning, item 6, Mr. Watt. Are you starting with that? You want to make a break? Okay, quick break, 5 minutes, please. Thanks. The Committee of the Whole back to order, and we're moving on to cruise ship dock waterfront planning. Is that you, Mr. Watt?
Yes, thank you, Deputy Mayor. So in your packet is a memo dated last week about cruise ship port planning. And I'll cut to the recommendation, and then we can talk about the how and the why. So I'm recommending that the COW, the memo says PWFC, that's a typo. The COW forward an appropriation of 200,000 of port development fees to the Assembly for the purpose of planning the optimal location of a cruise ship dock at the subport. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So we've seen by communication with our delegation and in the news that we've been tabbed as a home port for a Coast Guard icebreaker, which is incredibly exciting. We want to make sure that the Coast Guard's needs can be met. A dock, cruise ship dock is a big piece of infrastructure. It's complicated. And we want to make sure everything fits together. We also think the public is going to have a lot of interest in some very detailed questions about a cruise ship dock. And we think that a CBJ process that reports directly to the Assembly on a regular basis is going to be better for the public. And the public is going to have that direct connection with you as the decision makers. For a little trip down memory road, I went back into the archives to find a memo that I wrote in 2019, 3.5 years ago, when I recommended that we bid. I know, I can't believe it's 3.5 years ago either. But nobody remembered this when I brought it up, or nobody admitted remembering it anyway. But in 2019, when the Mental Health Trust put the subport property up for sale, I recommended that we bid on it, and we had a lot of conversations with the cruise ship industry collectively through CLIA. And CLIA wrote a letter in support of CBJ acquiring the property. And collectively, CLIA felt that Juneau could do that planning on whether there should be a dock. So CLIA supported CBJ taking the lead on that port planning activity. Well, we all know what happened after that. And it's understandable. So the cruise ship industry, the businesses, they try really hard to work together, but they are competitors. They are private sector businesses, and they do have to look out for their individual bottom line. And they all kind of broke rank and fell apart and bid on the property. And we remember, a lot since then. So we had 4 bids that we came in dead last, if anybody doesn't quite remember. Dead last. But I think I think by a factor of 5, but I think it helps the fact that we came in that far behind helps explain the value of a cruise ship dock to the industry. And I think a dock at the subport, it's not a foregone conclusion. So we have a number of issues that were raised during the visitor industry task force about, a lot of discussions about caps on limit or managing through infrastructures where we ended up. And the idea of a maximum of 5 ships, it's close to building a 5th cruise ship dock, but it's not exactly the same. I think the assembly is going to have a lot of questions on this, the siting of a dock, and a lot of questions on whether a 5th dock is good for the community. So I think regardless of how you feel about whether a 5th dock is good for the community or who should build it or who should finance it or who should control it, I do think the question today, much narrower. I think it's in the public's interest that CBJ take the lead on planning for that dock and for the Coast Guard. So my recommendation is a $200,000 appropriation of port development fees to get that process started. I do think it'll be more expensive than that, and I've asked the port director to put in a request for passenger fees that would come in through the budget, presumably be available July 1. But I do think that there are a lot of motivated people that want to work on this issue, and if we're going to take the lead, then we need to do so in a timely manner. So that's my recommendation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Watt. So you see the manager's recommendation on page 46. What questions do you have for him or anybody? Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Mr. Manager, you spoke to this during the retreat, and I heard you and understand and agree with you on the planning of, why it's important for CBJ to plan on the waterfront. I'm just slightly confused here because when I read, planning the optimal location of the cruise ship dock, is that just talking about the thing that extends out into the water part? Or is that, is that all you're recommending?
Mr. Watt?
Deputy Mayor, so all I'm recommending, so I think the presumption, and I think it's a good presumption, is if there is a cruise ship dock at the subport or at Gold Creek, it needs upland land. And the only realistic land is the property that Huna Totem owns. So the dock, I think, necessarily would have to connect to that land. And all I'm talking about is the maritime side of the equation, not what happens on the uplands.
Madam Mayor? Oh, you had a follow-up? No.
Yeah, my follow-up was just that. Can we not already work with Huna Totem or nudge them or direct them or whatever to put it in? I guess that we're just, is this like money, we're spending money to collaborate with? Anyway, I'm just trying to figure out
Mr. Watt?
why there needs to be extra money.
Deputy Mayor, so if the city sits on the sidelines, Huna Totem, I think logically would pursue a dock, thinking about what makes sense to that property. I don't doubt that they would try to reach out to the Coast Guard and collaborate, but they probably might not get very good feedback from the Coast Guard. I think the CBJ is uniquely situated as the local municipal government to work with the Coast Guard to make sure that the Coast Guard's needs are met, as well as our other waterfront needs. And so really what I'm saying is we, CBJ, should do work that if we do nothing, would have to be done by the Coast Guard and Hunatotum. And we should do it in a coordinated way in the public eye.
Mayor Weldon and then Ms. Dream. And then Mr. Bryson.
So, Mr. Watt,
Watt.
I didn't quite understand what you said before that you didn't think there was gonna be enough money already put in. So is the $200,000 enough? Or should we be saying up to $300,000 or what's the right amount? I do agree that the city should be more involved on this and because the last picture we saw, the dock was tilted quite a ways, which would impair building on the land to the right. You're standing on the shore. So I think we want to have more of an active role on this. So my question to you is about money.
Mr. Watt.
Deputy Mayor, I think it's going to be quite expensive. I don't have a good number. It'll be more than 200,000, but I think an appropriation of 200,000 in January gets this going. And I think that working with Mr. Yucatel and Ms. Pierce, the tourism manager, will come up with a process and a budget. But I do think the public is going to have a lot of questions. So thinking about back to when we built our 2 cruise ship docks, we had a lot of feedback about, what's it going to look like? What's the view plane going to look like? What's the navigational impacts? How's this going to affect this other commercial cruise ship dock? And there was study after study, more information after more information. And I just think that will continue on at this location because it is an area that has not traditionally had cruise ship traffic and commercial traffic. So I think people are going to be asking about the view plane. People are going to be asking about what happens to the ship at anchor, going back to the VITF. If there's a dock here, can there be a ship at anchor? I think there's going to be a lot of questions like that, a lot of little side project studies that come out of that public process.
Ms. Dream, Mr. Bryson, Ms. Hale. Ms. Hughes Candy's after that.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I remember meeting with Mr. Watt in the spring of 2019 and scheming about what we were going to do when we owned the subport lot. And here we are now. My question is about the Coast Guard. I just guess through the VITF and then talking about, how we ended up with 16B, I've become a little afraid of, they seem like this big impenetrable organization that has so much decision-making power. Have they signed on to this already? I'm assuming you're in contact with them.
Mr. Watt.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. No, the Coast Guard has not signed on to anything. In order for us to be, I think, effective, I think we need to grab the bull by the horns and say, here's what we think you should be looking at. So in the prior architects renderings for what was then the NCL property that were showing, the Coast Guard going out parallel. Well, Coast Guard might want to go perpendicular, might want to go parallel. There's probably pros and cons to all those things. There's probably port security issues. There's probably navigation issues, cost issues, efficiency uses of the waterfront. So I think we'll be working particularly with Senator Sullivan's office to make sure that we're heard.
Okay, Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Let me see if I can ask this question correctly. So you're wanting to do a correct port development so that you could figure out where a potential dock would go. We're not doing port development to figure out where we could build a dock or where we could own a dock, but where the potential docks could go. Is that too simplified, sir?
Mr. Watt.
Deputy Mayor, I think we want to figure out exactly where at the subport a cruise ship dock should go so that it does not harm other waterfront needs. And
Mi-
so that it is in the best location possible.
Follow up, Mr. Bryson?
Thank you, ma'am. So do you see this as a helpful step towards a potential Huna Totem dock then? If we're saying, hey, we've done all the studies, and if you apply to put your dock here, it's going to have the best chance. Is that what we could accomplish with this?
Mr. Watt?
Deputy Mayor, I think whoever builds a dock, this is going to be helpful. I'm essentially saying, let CBJ do this process for you.
Thank you.
Ms. Hale?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I have a couple questions, starting, Mr. Manager, I believe that the Coast Guard stopped working with Huna Totem, or there was some kind of, we're going to work with the Coast Guard, but the Coast Guard said no. I don't know if that was Huna Totem or if it's Norwegian. Could you clarify that?
Mr. Watt?
Deputy Mayor, so we had not communicated directly with the Coast Guard. Norwegian Cruise Lines had relayed that they had a tentative deal with the Coast Guard, which Huna Totem picked up, and then the Coast Guard communicated to Huna Totem that they were no longer interested. And if you remember Mr. Dick, when he did their presentation, I think he said something like, I can't speak for the Coast Guard on what they're thinking. And I think, one of the things certainly that's happening is Senator Sullivan is keenly interested in icebreakers and icebreakers being home ported in Alaska. And when it became clear that the Coast Guard was going to select an Alaskan port, and that port was going to be Juneau, I think the Coast Guard then wanted to have maximum span of control over their decision making. And likely it would always be challenging for the Coast Guard as a regulatory governmental agency to be in public-private partnership with a business that it regulates. And that may change, there may be a role for the municipality where there might be a role where the municipality can be in some kind of partnership with the Coast Guard that maybe is harder for them to be in with private industry. We don't know. So I think conversations with the Coast Guard are likely to be fairly complicated.
Follow up.
Ms. Hale?
Thank you. I guess, I support completely what you're trying to do here. And I really appreciate sort of the forward thinking here. Coast Guard's not Google. We actually do have mechanisms for talking with them, so that's not a bad thing. And I think the other thing for everyone who saw that icebreaker, that was the icebreaker that was here. It's really, really big, and it's not going to be nimble. And so the Coast Guard has some very, very important considerations if they're talking about home porting it there. That's not a very big Coast Guard dock. So I think this is a great idea.
Just know that the new icebreaker is not as big as that one, near as big. It's a
You
tiny,
stole my
it's a
thunder.
tiny thing. Sorry. I'm just saying it's not as big. I'm not saying it's not small, but anyway. Ms. Hughes Candies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Watts, not in a bad way. Some things I really would like to say that I agree with. I think this is going to be super complicated, or there's a lot of moving pieces. I think, yes, we want to be a friend to the Coast Guard and do what we can to fan the flames of having more Coast Guard home ported here. That's fantastic. I think the city is uniquely positioned to be a good player in all of these things. So I can agree wholeheartedly with all of that. I do very much appreciate that you dug out the 2019 memo, because I also remember approving an appropriation to go bid, which we so sadly lost. And I feel like your memo says for me better than what I would say for myself, because I think I said at the retreat, and this is going to sound like a echo kind of like of our Eagle Crest developments of talking about public process. I've expressed some frustration in some of our meetings that I feel like we went from having a conversation about let's amend the long range waterfront plan to see if we should have a dock there rather than argue and end up in appeal about whether you're allowed to because of that. Let's change that and then see if we should or we want a dock there. I think I very much understand from the cruise ship's perspective why they want a dock there and the urgency of getting something going. You mentioned benefits of us doing this work is that the Coast Guard efforts will be accelerated. Well, certainly we don't want to make an enemy of the Coast Guard, but to speak of accelerated efforts, I just go back to, I think you said when you were introducing the memo that, you know, it's not a done deal of whether there will be or will not be. But again, if I'm just watching as somebody who lives in Juneau, this public process, it really seems like there's been a transfer in land. There are good reasons for CBJ to get involved. But even with us getting involved, how can we be involved in creating a dock there and then simultaneously with this hand have a public process of whether there should be a dock there? And that's kind of the question that I'm asking myself, because I think if there's a dock there, we should work with all parties involved to make sure it's as successful as it can be, that it meets the Coast Guard's needs, that it meets our needs. And I have to ask that question because I don't know how we as a community can do that. How can we be involved and approve this appropriation and still in good faith to the public say we're having a public process in which you, the community, might reject having a dock in this location. And now I've got my good buddy Wade riled up. I know it's time for me to stop talking when he leans forward. So I'll just end by saying a line from your 2019 memo where you said the community should not be put in the position of reacting to an investor. And so I think we should just remember that.
Ms. Euskades, do you have a question about this particular, I mean, okay. No, I get it. No, I'm
back. It was not a question. I apologize.
Got it. Okay, Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. Now let me see if I can remember what my question was. So the Coast Guard, not at the table yet for this idea. I think you said Huna Totem is at the table and interested in this at our retreat, but I didn't see that in the memo. Could you speak to their interests, or maybe they can speak to their interests?
Well, I think Huna Totem is keenly interested in what we're doing. I think no doubt. I think they're keenly interested in how long a process this might take and what they might get to do at the end of it. So there'll be a lot of communication with everybody, certainly including Huna Totem.
I'm asking a question.
I asked that question wrong. Are they supportive of us playing this role?
Mr. Watt?
I mean, we'd have to actually ask them. I would say at the very least, they're probably a little bit uncomfortable. I would say at the very least. I think that's probably fair, but you'd have to ask them.
Okay, I have a question. So we have been hearing plans from NCL for 2 years, and the city has not yet said, hey, we want a plan for this place. So suddenly now we jump in and say, it's possibly because of the location that Huna Totem initially sketched was a different way and was in the way possibly of more things, or so. Why look, I believe the city should plan for its waterfront. So don't get me wrong on that. But here Huna Totem was going along and going to draw a dock somewhere. So 2 questions. How come we're doing this now and not 2 years ago? Because we were too pandemicking. And how is the timeline affect what Hunatotum expected to do.
So I'll go to the first one. So when we lost the bid for the property, we laid out a process and defined what we would do. And CBJ did everything that it said it would do. We made a decision that the assembly would decide to sit in a decision-making role as opposed to a appeal role of a planning commission process. We proactively made that decision. We decided to amend the waterfront plan so that Title 49 would not be the vehicle of decision that, rather than, having this dock at the subport go to the planning commission, the question being, is a dock permittable? Right? That's not the question that we thought was right. We thought the right question was, is a dock good for the community? As a community, we also did the visitor industry task force and set out a roadmap for what we think the community wants and needs on visitor industry management. So I would strongly assert that CBJ did everything that it said it would do on a timely basis. And we were not delayed in any of our actions by the pandemic. Now, whether NCL was delayed by the pandemic, I think is a fair question. And fair enough, I think they were. But in the time that NCL's had the property, they've been a little hard to pin down. We've asked repeatedly, when do you want to come and do an update? We're ready for you anytime, whenever you want to work on this. They told us for years that they had agreement with the Coast Guard, which conceptually looked good. But NCL has gone through a lot of change. They've had some very severe staffing changes to the point where almost nobody is left from their original team, and some people have been replaced more than once. So I don't think we're holding anybody up. They conveyed the property to Hunatotum this fall. And there's, the Hunatotum owns the property, but there's also another likely agreement out there between NCL and Hunatotum that we're not party to, nor will we probably ever know about. But our interest is in the whole waterfront, which is something we've said that was our interest all along. So I don't know what NCL's expectations were or Hunatotum's expectations were, but we have been the consistent player in this conversation for quite a few years now.
Mr. Watt, I'm just saying that we didn't say this to NCL 2 years ago when they started drawing things on the waterfront. We didn't say, hey, can you wait? We're going to do our thing. And we decided to do it now. And there's all kinds of, not faulting us necessarily, but it is curious that we're starting to do it now. And we're also planning part of an obligation that the property owner has. So while I also think the city has an obligation, we want to make sure that we could accommodate all kinds of needs there. Hunatotum owns land now that they have to plan for. So it also seems like the planning inside their immediate interest, they could pay for. So we're going to pay for siting their dock while they don't sort of do anything for a while. How does that work? Maybe they pay some amount, but maybe they hate this whole thing. I don't know. It's super complicated. So both those are, why now, and doesn't Hunatotum,
So I think that,
why are we planning their dock?
Yeah, so I'll jump in there. I think there are two big reasons. One, NCL was asserted that the Coast Guard was a participant in their planning. And that's not true. Or it's not accurate today. And second, we have to figure out how to accommodate an icebreaker. And I think those are big game changers. And I think it's incumbent on us with the last piece of our downtown waterfront to make sure that we get everything that we can for the community.
Mr. Bryson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I just want to remind everybody that while we're trying to do port development, we're also trying to do private-public partnerships, not just with what ends up at the Hunatotum area, but we just got done with a lengthy conversation, the private-public partnership for Gold Belt. If every time we enter into a private-public partnership, we put the screws down and we were like, okay, we got to do public process every step of the way. Well, I don't want to disregard the public process. If we're going to conduct business with private business, we can't just say only government rules apply. I mean, we have an entity that owes the city nothing, that wants to bring $150 million project to the community. Now, last I checked, there's not a lot of those going around. And so when we talk so definitively that, hey, this isn't, we don't think this might happen. We're going to we've got all these steps that even though you're trying to do something that is on your piece of property, that is within the code, so they haven't asked to get like special permissions yet. They're going to need to lease the tidelands from us for a dock. We knew that was coming. We shouldn't act like we have to stop this whole thing, drag it out as long as we possibly can so that every single individual downtown can have their 2 cents on it. We did have a very productive visitor industry task force. There's nothing that says we can't continue that on so that we can work some of these answers out. But I'm sitting here listening to this talk, and the only thing that I'm hearing say is you might be better to take your $150 million to another city. And I hate to say that, I'm the guy, I want this dock more than anybody, but that's what I'm hearing from the conversations. If we set so many roadblocks up that we make it difficult for them to develop this, then we are saying the same thing as don't develop the dock here. We should have a process. We should have a fair process. Tell them these are the steps that we're going to need to satisfy. This is the process we're going to use. But this shouldn't be like an up in the air question mark that we're going to take Hunatotum all the way through the process. This question of port development, and now we're like, well, is this part of, going to affect Hunatotum or not? Man, we have to get a little bit further in this or someone else is going to eat our lunch. And I don't mean to get frustrated with everybody here, but the direction that this conversation is going is it does not sound anything like a community that is welcoming $150 million investment that stretches out their downtown, satisfies a whole bunch of needs that the community's asked for, because I know that it's a tourism and a dock thing. It's the most controversial thing, but stacking the deck against the entity that's trying to do it, every party should have a seat at the table and should be able to have an opportunity to show how their interests work with the rest of the group. Thank you for the time, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Bryson. Madam Mayor. Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
But I can go after the meeting.
Okay.
Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Bryson. So when Mr. Dick did his presentation, I think we're all getting a little confused here. And he was talking about Hunatotum's, all his upland stuff. At that time, I believe he said, and maybe I'm wrong, that NCL was still the one building the dock. Has that changed? You guys are now building the dock? Okay. So that's was gonna be my question to you, Mr. Manager, but it sounds like now they're looking at building the dock. So that was confusing a little bit.
Okay. You good or you want more?
No, well, in answer to your question, I think everybody got a little more excited beside all the things that Mr. Manager said when they angled the dock to the side. I think that got everybody a little concerned.
I agree with you, Madam Mayor. That's why, but we could have done this 2 years ago. Miss Hale.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. 2 years ago, we didn't know about an icebreaker, so I think that's important. I understand, Mr. Bryson, your sense of urgency. I disagree that we want, I do not think that we want to short circuit public process. The public process around a cruise ship at that location and around the whole waterfront got hung up by 2 years of pandemic. And I think we've been hearing some of our fellow assembly members talking about that. But I also think that at its best, and I think some of what Mr. Manager is proposing in this memo is a really good approach. At its best, a community actually actively engages in planning. And there's a lot of things about our waterfront that we have not done that on. We have not actively engaged in planning, but rather let a lot of things just happen one by one, dock by dock. So I don't see this as holding things up. I see this as taking pretty complex factors, a Coast Guard icebreaker. Coast Guard is a great big federal agency, and a potential private dock and privately owned property, and taking those things before, putting those together so that we can actually have some plans around that section of the waterfront, and the community can actually understand what's happening, and the community can be engaged in what's happening. So I think the pandemic really set us all back because a lot of that engagement was not able to happen. And it's time to have that engagement. It's time to, actually really get going on this. So I really don't see this as holding up a project and holding up the process. I see this as moving it forward.
Thank you, Ms. Hale. Mr. Watt, I had two questions and we got hung up on my first one, and the one, I don't know what, if you said an answer to the timeline regarding how it affects Hunatotum. In other words, when I saw 200,000, I was like, that sounds good. I really think we should do it. Then you talked about it being more expensive and taking more time. So that made me nervous about how long are you talking? I mean, when the dock got put in a certain spot, it made me nervous. Like, wait, no, we need to know if that's okay for the rest of the things we're going to do on our waterfront. And that's the kind of sketches I in my head was thinking about, figuring out where the dock would go. But you are making words about more money and more time. And I wonder what, it sounds like you might be thinking of a bigger process than I was thinking about. If you could talk about timeline and scope.
Well, Deputy Mayor, I mean, I think what we're talking about is providing enough information to answer all the questions that get asked. And I'm looking at 8 people who are probably going to ask a lot of those questions and trying to predict how much public feedback you're going to be getting and how many questions you're going to ask. So I think it's going to be extensive. Cruise ship dock, when we built 2, they were nominally $30 million each for the dock, not for the uplands. It's a significant investment, and I don't think you're going to make a decision without some pretty detailed planning and without some pretty good understanding of how that dock affects the port and the community. I don't have any intention of dragging this out, but I also think I think the public is going to they're going to be doing several things, but there'll be an element of the public holding up the visitor industry task force saying, don't do anything until you do everything that's in this. You're going to have people saying, build a dock. You're going to have these people saying, don't build a dock under any circumstances. And then we have the Coast Guard in the mix. So, I'm looking over at Mr. Yucatel, and his predecessor started the planning for the downtown docks. And Mr. Etheridge is nodding. And it took quite a while to decide to build what I'm going to call is an easier project. And there's no judgment on my part on whether, it's a better or worse idea. I just think the public process is going to be demanding.
Mr. Rod, and I agree with you. My concern at this point is where is that planning burden? I think we should figure out where a dock could go, and all the moving it a foot or 7 feet. I mean, that's on the property owner. In other words, I don't think we're designing the same kind of process we had to design for 16B, where we had to say, here, this one, how that one, here, this one. I mean, that's to me, the property owner does that for her dock. And we just say, as long as your dock's within this place, it's not going to mess up development here and it's not going to mess up development here. To me, that's the question we should be asking, not the fine particulars of a process that should be owned by Huna Totem, not by the city. I don't think we should be personally shopping around Huna Totem's sketches. So I'm just trying to, only reason I'm bringing it up is seems like we have different ideas of what this process is. Do you think it's something different than what I just said?
I think it's more complicated than what you're thinking. I think the more detail, I mean, so far, Huna Totem has nominally shown us a rectangle on the waterfront. I think once you start really fleshing it out, then the questions start coming more heavily.
And you think that belongs in the city's court?
I think the city is best situated because I think a lot of those questions are going to be, what about the Coast Guard? How does this work for the Coast Guard? And what about ships at anchor? And what about 5 ships, 5-ship agreements? And what about 1.5 million passenger cap? And what about hot berthing? I think all that stuff gets conflated. I don't think you can separate it out.
Ms. Dream, then Ms. Hughes Candies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I'm much more confused than I was when this meeting started, but and I will say I never want to play poker with anybody who works at Huna Totem because I absolutely cannot tell how they feel about this idea. So just to get this, I get I get why CBJ would want to do this because we have an interest in the whole thing, whereas Huna Totem has an interest in one specific spot. The Coast Guard has an interest in one specific spot. We're the ones with the interest in the whole thing. I can see why it makes sense that we would undertake this planning and we could incorporate a public process, but ultimately we could come up with a $200,000, $300,000, $500,000 plan, but it's not going to make either of those other parties do anything if they don't want to. Is right?
Well, that's correct. So I mean, I think on the part of Huna Totem, a pivotal piece of success for them is convincing the assembly to give them a Tidelands lease. Right. So if this paves all of the way for the thinking that gets them a Tidelands lease, then it's beneficial. If on the part of the Coast Guard, the Coast Guard has selected Juneau as a home port, and nominally they think that might lead to hundreds of millions of dollars of investment in the community, but they don't have an icebreaker yet. And I think that it is incumbent on us to figure out everything we can to make sure that we help the Coast Guard really cite an icebreaker here. It's great to be selected as an icebreaker port, but it would be the real deal to have the Coast Guard invest the money and actually do it.
Ms. Hughes Candies. More, Ms. Dream. Ms. Hughes Candies.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Earlier, when I said I didn't have a question, it was because I felt like there was not really something in there that you could respond to, but it's helpful hearing you respond to all of these other questions. And you really kind of boiled it down to its essence and characterized the motivations of sort of all the different players. A moment ago, you said you'll have your people who say this and you'll have your people who say that, and some will hold up the VIDIF. And I completely agree with that. The Coast Guard is in some ways a little bit of an external, it's one of the interest parties, and we want them here, but it's also a little bit external. It's the federal government. We're pleased to have been selected and we'll do what we can to stick them here. I'm curious, maybe you could respond to that. I said, I don't know how we commit money to something and then feel like we can answer to all of those different groups and, sort of be that neutral body we're supposed to be. But what would be your take on that?
I think it's better to control the investigation so that you have the information. I think the worst thing that would happen is if the assembly has to feel like it has to make a decision and it doesn't have enough information or the information it wishes it had.
Well,
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. If I make a comment, are people making comments still, or are people
what if we
asking
have the mayor
questions?
make a motion and then we could talk about the
Okay,
motion?
thanks.
Madam Mayor, why don't you take a stab?
All right, so I recommend, his recommendation is faulty. I move that we for an appropriation ordinance, and Mr. Watt, I'm gonna go against you, up to $300,000 of the port development fee to give them little wiggle room to the full assembly for the purpose of planning the optimal location of a cruise ship dock at the subport. And the reason I'm going a little higher is he said it was gonna be a little more expensive. If they only want to spend $200,000, then that's why I did the up to 300.
Okay, comments about the motion? Ms. Wall.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I think, there's a lot swirling around in this conversation, but I think I'm supportive of that motion, but only in a circumstance where we know that the parties that we're talking about are going to work with us and want to work with us. And so otherwise, I don't think this is useful. So I would just ask before I'm fine forwarding it to the full assembly, but for me to support it ultimately, I want some indication that we're going to be able to work with both the Coast Guard and Huna Totem.
More comments on the motion? You were ready for the vote on the motion then? Okay, Ms. Huskianis.
I'll just say that I'm fine with sending this to the assembly, but I'm going to have conversations with staff. I'm not sure that I'm going to support it when it gets to the assembly.
Mr. Smith.
Yeah, I'm the same, and then I'm happy to move it forward. And of course, we have months now to hear from parties involved and members of the public and letters and all that type of thing. So we'll get more information. Thank you.
More? Also, I would just say I'm also fine moving it. Again, my concern is how much of this process are we going to grab and how long is it going to take? But we have some time to talk about that. So I don't hear any objection to the motion. So there you go. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Watt. Okay, one more thing, and this information item. It's to update us on, we sent the hazard maps already on. Mr. Watt, go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. So you had an a substantial information session about hazard mappings at the November 7th COW. You actually did two things. You asked a bunch of questions and in the middle of those questions made a motion to send it on. So this, there are answers to the questions. There were a couple about financing and insurance. And then there were also questions about how to compare the old maps and the new maps. And there's a link where you can do that. But since you made the motion to forward already, I guess I'm asserting that you don't actually need to do anything tonight.
Right. So here's the answers to the questions we had. Any other questions or? Okay, don't see anything further to come before the committee of the whole. Mr. Bryson had a thing.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. I have been invited by the Downtown Business Association to attend the Main Street USA conference at the end of March. The DBA has offered to pay for my lodging and for the course. I will take care of all of the other expenses with it, but I needed the Assembly's approval. I believe that's all that I
Any
needed.
objections to
Any
Mr.
objections to me splitting the
Bryson
cost
going?
with DBA?
Madam Mayor?
I don't have an objection, just to make double sure that check with APOC before you do anything,
I will do that. And then I was informed that I get to give a report when I return as one of the requirements.
Excellent. We look forward to your report, Mr. Bryson.
Thank you.
Anything more to come before the committee of the whole? Thank you, everybody. Merry Christmas. Ho, ho, ho. Happy holidays. See you in, well, end of January for me and the Madam Mayor.